Hello everyone, welcome to AWS interview question series. Today we will discuss an AWS interview question related to IAM policy evaluation logic. In the previous videos we have discussed about cross account access, how Lambda get access to AWS resources, assume role versus resource based policies, and least privilege security design. Today we are going one step deeper. We are going to understand the basic logic AWS uses to evaluate a request and decide whether to allow it or deny. This is where AWS IAM policy evaluation logic comes into the picture. In this video, we are going to build a simple mental model that you can use to understand how AWS makes the final decision. So let's first clearly understand the interview question. How does AWS decide whether an API request is allowed or denied? What happens when a request reaches AWS? It is allowed or denied. Let's understand the logic step by step. We will take a real example and understand what happens behind the scene. Imagine a user wants to download an object from S3 bucket. To do that, a user wants to make an API request to Amazon S3. Now AWS has to make a decision. Should this request be allowed or denied? To make that decision, AWS needs to understand the request and evaluate the policies that applies to it. Let's see how AWS does that. AWS first needs to understand what the request is actually asking for. Every API request has important information associated with it. First, who is making the request? This is principal. The second one is what operation are they trying to perform? This is the action. Then which resources are they trying to access? This is the resource. And finally, what other conditions or context apply to the request? So at high level, we can think of request context as principal plus action plus resource plus context. Once AWS understands this request context, it can evaluate the applicable policies applies to that request. Now here is an example where Alice wants to download an object from S3 bucket. This is a CLI command which used for downloading an object from S3 bucket. Now AWS request will conceptually look like there is a principal Alice, what action they are trying to do, what are the resources, and what is the context. The next step is to evaluate the applicable policies. Depending on the request, AWS may evaluate identity based policies, resource based policies, service control policies, permission boundaries, and session policies. Identity based policies are attached to IAM users, groups, and roles. Resource based policies are attached directly to the resources, such as S3 bucket policies. Permission boundaries define maximum permissions that an IAM principal can have. SCP act as permission guardrail at organization level. Now, session policies can further restrict permissions for temporary session. The important point to note here is not every policy type applies to every request. AWS evaluates the policies that are applicable to specific request. Let's look at the most important rule in AWS IAM policy evaluation. This is the golden rule which says explicit deny always wins. Whenever AWS evaluates a request, if an applicable policy contains an explicit deny for that request, the final decision is deny. It doesn't matter if another applicable policy allows the same request. The explicit deny takes precedence over the allow. Let's understand this with an example. So here is a policy 1 which allows the request and another policy which explicitly denies it. So the final decision is deny. Explicit deny always has precedence over allow. Now we know that explicit deny always wins. But what happens when AWS does not find the explicit deny? For a request to be allowed, there must be an applicable allow for the requested action and resource, and there must be no explicit deny. If AWS finds the applicable allow and no explicit deny, the request will be allowed. There is the simple rule, allow plus no explicit deny is allow. Let's look at this with an example. Here is a policy 1 which say allow, and another policy there is no explicit deny. So the final decision is allow. Allow plus no explicit deny is allow. Now, what happens if AWS does not find the applicable allow? We know that explicit deny results in deny. But what if there is no explicit deny? Does that mean AWS automatically allows the request? The answer is no. The absence of explicit deny does not mean the request is automatically allowed. If AWS finds no applicable allow, the request is denied. This is called implicit deny. So remember, no allow plus no explicit deny equals implicit deny. The key takeaway is AWS does not require explicit deny to reject the request. If there is no applicable allow, the request is denied by default. Let's look with an example. So here is a policy 1 which says no allow, and another policy is no explicit deny. So the final decision AWS makes is implicit deny. So the request will be denied. Now let's put everything together into a simple flow. First, AWS request arrives with principal, action, resources, and relevant request context. AWS evaluates the applicable policies. Then we ask, is there an explicit deny? If the answer is yes, the decision is denied. If there is no explicit deny, we ask for, is there an applicable allow? If no, the request is implicitly denied. If yes, then the request can be allowed, assuming the relevant authorization controls restrictions are satisfied. So simple flow is understand the request, evaluate the applicable policies, check for explicit deny, check for applicable allow, and arrive at the final decision, deny or allow. Let's summarize this as interview ready answer. When an AWS API request is made, AWS evaluates the request context, the applicable policies, and authorization controls to determine whether the request will be allowed or denied. First, AWS identifies the principal, the action being requested, the resources being accessed, and relevant request context. AWS then evaluates the applicable policies, such as identity-based policies, resource-based policies, service control policies, permission boundaries, session policies depending on the request. At high level, AWS starts the evaluation with default implicit deny. AWS needs to find an applicable allow for the requested action and resource. Then AWS checks the applicable explicit deny. If AWS finds matching explicit deny, the request is denied because explicit deny overrides the allow. If there is no explicit deny, but there is no applicable allow, the request will be denied due to implicit deny. Then, relevant boundaries, SCPs, session policies, conditions can also affect whether the permission can be actually exercised depending on the request. That's the core IAM evaluation logic you should remember for the interviews. If you like this video, please subscribe and follow for more AWS interview questions.